Bienvenidos sean todos ustedes. Welcome everybody to this particular transmission, and it's not only particular because we are beginning a little bit earlier, but believe me, it is all worth it, especially because of the guest that we have tonight, and I am really glad to have among us Stephanie Phillips. How are you doing, Steph?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure. I was really delighted when you show support and willingness to participate in this. This brief talk is not going to be like really deep. Well, perhaps it will be about one of the titles that I have been recommending during the latest months, and it's something that I have really enjoyed, and it's actually the main topic. If you have been paying attention to how this particular episode was being promoted, well, it's focused on the Butcher of Paris. Hopefully I am doing a proper pronunciation. If not, you will please correct me. Which is a title that you wrote and is being published by Dark Horse. So let's begin. Before we get into the topic, remember guys that if you are watching this in any of the other channels that we have, Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube, please join us at Twitch, and if you are in there participating, actually your comments will be being shown at the lower part of this conversation, and if you have any questions for Steph or for me, just let me know and I will pass the questions to Steph. So I am closing the transmission right now from Facebook at this very moment. You have 3 seconds to move to Twitch, 2 seconds to move to Twitch, and I'm not kidding guys, there you are. I am at this very moment deleting. Yes, all right, move to Twitch. All right, so let's go back. All right, Steph, sorry about that, the kind of I don't know, control damage about the people who are watching this. So The Butcher of Paris, it's a mini-series. I believe that it's 5 issues, right?
Yes, 5 issues.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little bit about when you found out about this particular case? Because it's one of the, I don't know if most famous, but it's one of the most monstrous serial killers that have been known, at least for the last century. So can you tell us a little bit about how did you find information about this case and what drove you to write this particular story?
Yeah. So I think I first heard about it in a book I was reading about World War II and the occupation of France. And there was this kind of like a footnote in the book that was like, the trial for this serial killer, part of it was put on hold when the invasion of Normandy happened. And then it kind of went on. And I was like, wait a minute, you just mentioned this trial about a serial killer and kind of like glazed over it. So I want to know more about this. Obviously I did some Googling. I found a couple podcasts that were talking about it. And one thing I noticed was just there was a lot of information kind of all over the place. So every podcast was like adding new information or telling a different version of the story. The number of victims was always different. It ranged everywhere from 20 victims to 200 victims, which is a really huge disparity. So really what I wanted to do was just initially start putting together how much factual information I could find. I really like doing research. So I started pulling up any book that mentions it and just kind of following their sources and finding where they found this information, just trying to verify where it came from. Now, obviously, we're working with a 5-issue story of, I would really say, historical fiction. So a lot of the information we're giving is as accurate as possible while still telling a story. So my intent was not to give somebody a fact sheet or a bulleted list of everything that happened, but to really help somebody connect to the story, because I've had people say, well, I can go find out what happened on Wikipedia, why would I read this? So even though the ending of the story might be a little bit predicted if you've read the Wikipedia page on this incident, really how we're getting there and the characters that we follow, even though they are all factually based characters, the intent was more how you connect to the people that are kind of navigating both the Nazi occupation and the serial killer running rampant in the Nazi-occupied Paris. So that was kind of how we got to the story.
And it's interesting because, yes, of course, you as a reader can say, well, don't worry. If I wanted actually factual information, I could find it if I go to the Wikipedia. But guess what? If you go to the Wikipedia page of Marcel Petiot, there you will find that the article has multiple issues. Please help improve or discuss because of the various and it says in there there's conflicting information about that. So when you were doing the research, and you have already mentioned it because there were different elements that kept adding part of this story. So when you were doing the research, how did you feel when you were finding, like, I don't know, conflicting information with previous sources?
I know that is just because, I really wanted to first understand why we were getting so much conflicting information. And I think part of that is because this is somebody that was, to the day he was executed, he kept saying he was innocent. And anybody that could really say otherwise was dead. So it becomes a really difficult situation where there's very minimal evidence. Anything that could have been called evidence, he was incinerating, he was putting in lime pits that he built kind of in a basement area. So all of this evidence was being destroyed that would link him to this, and he denied it until his death. So it's really hard to kind of parse out, what is real, and I think that's why there's so many conflicting pieces of information. So one of the things I didn't want to do was say, well, he, on such and such date, he killed this person, or start adding those up, because I don't think that really helps get at why this case is so fascinating. So I think what makes it really fascinating is the time period itself, Paris, the occupation, and then our main character is Detective Massou and his son Bernard, which for me, writing them was really wonderful. I really, really enjoyed writing a father-son dynamic and how those two were trying to have a family, having a relationship while Detective Massou is working a serial killer case, and also trying to navigate the relationship between the French police and the Gestapo, which is very strange, which we see obviously every time that Massou encounters Joachim. He's like, I want to kill this guy. Obviously, he's a Nazi, but also there's tension over who's in charge, which is historically something that happened. The French police kind of had a decision to make, which was abandon the post and let the Gestapo come in and basically take over all of Paris. Or for some people that chose to stay, as Detective Massou did, it was like, try to find the line between not inciting the Gestapo to kill you, but also at the same time pushing back on them, which, as we see, bites Massou in the butt. In issue 4, you kind of see historically that actually is what happened to Detective Massou, which I don't know that I want to spoil if somebody hasn't read it, so I'm trying to not say it. I didn't realize I was walking myself into a spoiler there, but
yeah, and it's part of what makes interesting this story. Because you're also dealing with the human element in here. So, for example, you have already mentioned about some of the dynamics that are present in there, the anchors for let's say, for the good guys in here, but it's kind of also a complicated surrounding that we have in here because, the biggest and most important event from the last century was World War II. And in a city, for example, this is something particular that it's kind of interesting. I am in one history and archaeology grouping in Facebook, and for example, one of the memes that they were passing today was like, when you try to explain to an American that the French actually were really good fighting, but you usually remember the French as the guys who lost, the guys who surrendered on World War II. But that's because you only perhaps have read the very end of that story. And this is the surrounding where this is happening. You have a character that is selling hope, that is trying to encourage people, that telling them that they can have a better life. They can go outside of the occupied place in one of the most difficult times in there. So, and that's actually how the story begins. And we have this, let's say, merchant of hope in here that actually transforms into into the title of this story. When you were focusing on how the elements were presented as the evidence was being shown, how were you deciding about what kind of elements can we show? Because, well, obviously, as you mentioned, we have historical facts, but then we have also the human aspect. We have also the way that it can be something relatable to people. So how were you deciding about how to include these elements in there?
So I think the first thing I wanted to consider was the gore element. I think serial killers kind of fall into this weird genre of, yeah, so this is about as gory as it gets, and that's in issue one. And from there, we really, it's a very conscious decision to not make the scene any gorier than this. So after this page at the end of issue one, it's very based on the psychology of the people interacting in occupied France. It's about the father-son dynamic, and of course the mystery of trying to catch somebody that's still loose in Paris. But the first decision to make was, I don't want this to be serial killer porn. This is not my intent. I was really hesitant to even write a story in that genre, because even though I know it's very popular, I think it's something that a lot of that kind of content falls into that trap. And I really didn't want to lose sight of the victims. But I also wanted to show, more than anything, how people were responding. What is it like to be in an occupied city? And then this added layer of suspense and tension. So showing people getting kind of swept up in the craze of having a serial killer. You can see as the media gets more and more involved, or in the trial in issue 5, the way that women are kind of reacting to this person that's on the stand for being a serial killer. And when Masu kind of makes his final entrance and says some of the final lines of the books about, have these people forgotten? And the audience laughs at this because, again, this is a reminder, they just went through World War II, where the amount of lives lost is such an astronomical number that you almost lose the individual in that number. Because if you think about how many people were killed, like, you start to hear these giant figures, and I think our brains sometimes shut down. I mean, we're doing this now with the number of COVID cases. Like, I have family in Florida, so I keep getting these updates about the number just skyrocketing of both deaths and things like that. And I think it's reached a point where people have stopped paying attention to it for, a host of reasons. But one is, I think, the way that we relate to numbers. I don't think numbers are very personal. So it's one thing to tell somebody how many people, whether this guy did kill, let's say that the highest number I've heard is 200 victims. Let's say that is how many he killed. That's a huge number, but how can we make this story more personal? How can we gain something from learning about him? How can we gain something from watching Masu and Bernard try to have a father-son dynamic? Historically, Detective Masu did bring Bernard on a lot of cases with him, almost like a Sherlock Watson, having somebody to bounce ideas off of, which I find really quaint. Since my dad is the one that introduced me to Sherlock Holmes as a kid, I kind of felt like writing their dynamic was very personal for me. And that kind of translated into, well, if writing this is very personal for me, then how can I make this personal as well for the audience? How can I make that number something that we relate to on a personal level and not just a bullet point? And I am not trying to discredit American education systems where we try to teach students facts about these things. But I mean, in one way, it reminds me a lot of, I was really fortunate. I had an amazing history teacher growing up that I think took this same approach to history, which was, we've got a bunch of, I think we were in 8th grade. 8th graders are terrible. 8th graders are not the most engaged or interested in school in most cases. But this was somebody that went out of their way to show up to class dressed as a Union soldier and take on a new persona and he made us hardtack. So we would sit in class and eat hardtack and talk to him about what it was like to be a soldier in the Civil War. And for me, that was a very personal, clearly I have not forgotten it. So if we're talking about trying to help people connect to history, I really kind of took that as my mission in this book, which is I love facts. I love reading books about facts and history, historical fiction, but I also wanted to make sure that this book was something different than a Wikipedia article. Again, not knocking it, but trying to give you other things, other ways to engage, which is never a bad thing, I think.
Yeah, it makes you care about the story. It makes you care about the characters, even though perhaps right now they might seem like a footnote, as you mentioned. And there we have, like, for example, some quotes, like the difference between a tragedy and a statistic is just a number. Perhaps if you lose just one person, for you can be a personal tragedy. But in this particular moment of history, well, the numbers were different. And I want to send a shout out to Dave Jonhson, if I'm correct, who made all the cover art, because this is from the issue 3 that actually reflects part of what you are mentioning here, because we are in this case in a close surrounding, and we have a picture of a menacing figure with a knife. Okay, that's something that might feel perhaps more personal because it's in the same room that you are in there, but you are once again surrounded in this case by the element of death, by all the killing that are happening right now in there. And for example, since I am talking about issue 3, you also include some of the elements from for the backgrounds of the characters, where we also deal in this particular case with death. So what do you think is the relationship that some of your characters, in this case the main villain and the main protagonist, or the main detective in this case, have? What's the kind of relationship that they have with this element always present, particularly in war?
So one of the things I wanted to show, and I really wanted to stay away from playing psychologist as well. That's not my job. That's not what my degree is in. So I don't want to start making broad generalizations about anyone's psyche. But this main character, our serial killer, he had a history. It's a lot to show in 5 issues. So one of the things I tried to show was just a couple instances of showing who this person is. Obviously, one of the things Masu would do when he was interviewing family, friends, anyone that worked with Marcel Petiat, he would definitely want to know, who was this person? You have to try to figure out who they are. So I started with one vignette of him. He did serve in World War I, and he was dismissed and later served a very long period of time in a psychiatric ward. A grenade blew up his foot. By almost all accounts present, he did it himself. Both the direction the grenade landed, it kind of turned out to be like hard to say somebody threw it at him just based on how it landed. And also people around him were like, hey, this dude threw a grenade at himself. He was also caught multiple times stealing medical supplies and blankets and things like that. So all of this kind of added up to 3 strikes you're out kind of deal, sent him to a psychiatric ward. And while he was in the psychiatric ward, that is where he became a doctor. So I guess he was like, well, I have a lot of time on my hands in this psychiatric ward. I guess I'll become a doctor. So that's interesting. But one of the things I wanted to do, was not just show all the history of him, because again, I want to focus on the present. And one of the things I think is really interesting is that Detective Masu was kind of called the French Sherlock. And I wanted to really play with, how is he thinking about this case? How does he approach the case? And his son, Bernard, was a law student. So I tried to think about, like, what is he imparting to his son besides just how do we think about interviewing suspects? But also kind of I'm talking to my son about interviewing suspects. What does that look like? And it's in, I believe it is issue 3, right as we come out of that flashback of World War I. One of my favorite pages in the entire book. He is talking to his son about, how do you interview people? How do you, try to get the best information out of them? And as he's talking to Bernard about this, he's like fixing his bow tie because it was a little bit askew. And it's just such a dad moment. Like he is at the same time a detective and a father, and I want to make sure that nobody ever forgets that. And it's genuinely my favorite moment in the book, and I own that page. And getting to see it in person when Dean gave it to me, I was like, this is Dean's work is really incredible on the entire series, but being able to see it in person was really cool. And that page might be going to my own father for Father's Day and his birthday tomorrow. So I really hope he's not watching this before that, but he'll open it tomorrow. So.
Don't worry, I will just speak a lot of Spanish, so in case that is catching me here, he will be like syntonizing the FM radio. ¿Por qué estoy escuchando esto en español? Demonios, canal equivocado.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't think he knows what Twitch is, so I think we're okay. But that really, I think it just spoke to me of like, this is what I'm trying to do, is showcase the relationship between these two characters. You know, at one moment he is a detective, but the reason we're hearing about his process is because he's trying to help instruct Bernard, but not just teach him. He's still being a father. Like, your bow tie is messed up, let me help you. So I think, you know, Dean is really the perfect choice for telling this story, because as you can see, and it's just little details like that just come through. So it's not just the way he talks to him, but the body language between him and Bernard is just incredible. And you know, Dean's work in that, if you just go back and sometimes look, sometimes there are little things that even I missed in the way they briefly touch one another or stand close together or something, that I'm just like, it's incredible storytelling. So it was really nice to be able to work with Dean and Jason on that story.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, can you tell us a little bit precisely about how were you developing this story together? Because, well, comics is a a medium in collaboration. So obviously you are the writing, but the art from Dean Kotz. We have already mentioned the covers from Dave Jonhson's, the lettering from Toy Peteri or Peteris. Hopefully I'm not
Petrie.
Petrie.
It took me a while to realize that too. I almost didn't want to say it, and I got to the point where I knew him so long that I was like, it's going to be really awkward when I ask him, because I've known him for like 4 years, but it's fine. I got it. It's Petrie.
All right. Thanks. Yeah. Perhaps I will wink when I want to mention once again his last name, so I won't mispronounce it. So can you tell us a little bit precisely about the collaboration and when you were telling the story about the interactions and how it was like the common forth from the ideas?
Yeah. So it's definitely highly collaborative. Dean and I were working on this together before it was at Dark Horse. And, you know, a lot of stuff, I would send him things and we would talk about how something might play out. And, you know, I always want to not be too, like, I don't want to back anybody into a corner and be like, it has to be drawn this way. So letting Dean add a lot of things to the pages, and, you know, you can really clearly see his storytelling coming through, because he's an incredible storyteller. But one of the things, you know, I really wanted to make sure I did was try to do like the burden of the research that was, you know, it's not his job to go dig through archives and things like that. So I wanted to take as much as I could to help give him. So at some point, I was able to find a couple of pictures. There's not too many pictures that exist of the townhome that this takes place in. But I did try to kind of piece it together from old photos that I scanned and gave Dean. And I just remember a very early on conversation with Dean was like, what is the layout of this townhome? So kind of comparing it to other townhomes in the area, like anything we could find. So a lot of that kind of building, it's not so much world building because it was already established, but there were still things within this story that we had to kind of collaborate on and build together. So working with Dean and then obviously Jason, great relationship, and Troy letters 98% of the things I write. So with Troy, it's very easy to work with because I have like shorthand in my scripts, things that I know Troy understands and just will nail. So I was actually talking with him about it the other day, just like the color that he used in the balloons and things like that. I think all of the decisions Troy made are very, very smart in the book and enhance in ways that, you know, I don't know how much average readers spend looking at word balloons, but I like font and typography and things like that. So I'm always very invested in, I think all three of them, you know, working on this made an absolutely gorgeous piece of art.
Indeed. And you mentioned a little bit about the world building. And for example, in storytelling, for example, if you're a film student, there are like some shortcuts that you can use when you want to participate in a project. And it's like, take into account characters that are already established. So for you, when you just put it in the screen, people will pretty much know everything about that. It's like if I want to make, a short film about Jesus Christ, pretty much everybody knows about him. If I want to make a story located or in time or a place, in this case in World War II, well, there are some elements that are actually already in the mind of, in this case, of the reader. So how did you how did you look into the elements that make this particularly your story? Some of the elements that perhaps, yes, we are in Paris, yes, we are in this particular time period, but for this story, these are some of the elements that make that this story could only happen at this moment. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think two of the personal things that I added to this story that are very specifically me. The first thing I kind of talked about the father-son relationship. Mm-hmm. That was really big for me. I really loved the couple references I read where newspapers called Massu the French Sherlock. That's like, warning bells for me. Anything Sherlock, I'm there. The first book, my dad is a book collector, and we used to go to this little used bookshop, and he bought me this, like, I still have it. It's a cheaply leather-bound copy of Hound of the Baskerville. Sherlock stories, my first Sherlock story, and I thought because it had like a fancy cover and some leather involved, this was like a prized possession. Like, this is the thing you treat really well, because my dad's books look kind of similar and he treats them very well. So obviously this is like worth money, or I'm sure we got it for like $5. So putting that element into the book, my love for mystery and puzzles and I love Sherlock Holmes represented in the father-son relationship, what that means to me. So that was very personal. The other thing I did, which maybe doesn't show up as much, it does in some of the back matter of what I was writing. I'm Dutch and most of my family is from Holland, and also Jewish. So I did a lot of research on my own my own family's heritage and things that I didn't know up until this point in my life. And so kind of having that as the backdrop for writing, I think enhanced my own perception of why a lot of these things mattered, or how we connect to history, by doing a lot of that personal research. In the first issue, Dark Horse let me include kind of an essay I wrote about some of my own family history and research to those moments, and some pictures of my relatives and things like that have served over the years. I think there's a picture in there of my great-grandfather that served in World War I. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, there we go. A chance that I had in undergrad to meet Elie Wiesel, and there's a quote from him in there as well. So getting to kind of speak with him when I was in undergrad, he taught a short story workshop at the first university I went to, and he talked to like my entire class just about story and narrative, and like personal connections to that narrative and memoir writing and things like that. So having the chance to meet him before he died was obviously a huge influence on me as somebody that's still trying to learn about their connection to my Jewish ancestry, but also as a storyteller. And those are things that I carry with me and really wanted to recognize in that first issue. So thankfully Dark Horse let me write quite a bit about that.
Excellent. And it also helps us to understand a little bit more about the connection, in this case, that the writer has with the story. And if it's a little bit more personal, as we mentioned before, perhaps it feels a little bit more personal to the reader in this case, because you at least you can see that kind of connection that you have in there. And one question, but perhaps this won't be publicly discussed, because we love the work that Dark Horse did in here. But in case, if you had the chance perhaps to make it instead of a 5-issue miniseries, if you had more time, do you think that it could perhaps you could have used that space, like with an extra issue or something more? Or I believe that at least I am happy with the final the final 5 issues in there. But I don't know, perhaps there were some things that were left aside from what was published.
I can't imagine any writer being like, no, I don't want more space. So I mean, there's definitely that element. I have before going with Dark Horse, I mean, we had done this in all different ways, where we had a contingency where it could be 6+ issues. We had a contingency where it was 5 and 4 and so on, like just kind of preparing for what it needed to be at where we were able to place it. I think, I'm really happy with the final product. I like how the 5 issues come together. At some point, it's probably best for somebody to be like, you've done too much history, stop. Like, sometimes it's always nice to have somebody that's like, this is the amount of time, this is your constraint, and to work within that. So, my job was to work within that constraint of the 5 issues for all of us. And, I think I'm really happy with the way the 5 issues came out. So, if somebody tomorrow was like, here's 12 more issues, like, heck yes, I'll write 12 more issues on the Butcher of Paris. But, I mean, it's something I'd like to revisit one day, maybe in prose or things like that, because again, there was so much research that isn't accounted for in those 5 issues. And, it was about trying to blend the space between the research that I did and still trying to tell a very compelling story. So those 2 things had to function simultaneously, which was a lot harder than I thought it would be, because it's like, okay, some of these pages need to get changed or altered because I'm just data dumping or something like that. So it's about pulling back and remembering that we are telling a story, and that's how the audience is going to connect to it. So I don't know, maybe one day I'll revisit it as like a prose, like a real historical book on all the research I've done. That would be really interesting.
Yeah. For example, I was remembering one of the first interviews that we have in this show. It was with Ian Tragilis, and for his trilogy. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the Milk Witch trilogy, if I'm not mistaken. And it was kind of interesting because even though after he finished his trilogy, because he had a trilogy deal for 3 books, obviously, if not it couldn't be a trilogy. Sorry about that. But he also released some like let's say like chapters, but it was more like a novelette. Because it was like perhaps some of the surrounding stories, or perhaps something like that happened before. Some of the elements that perhaps you can have when you are putting all the elements in a story, and perhaps you are just cutting because it's not part of the main plot. But he got this chance to at least publish in a different format. Perhaps it was just like an ebook. But if you like that universe, well, that's the chance to revisit that. And in this particular universe, and don't worry, I won't spoil the end of the series. We won World War II. And I say that as a Mexican because we just sent one squad in there. So, yeah, right. Oops, spoiler. But for example, for the very last issue, and once again, I am really amazed about the incredible work that you all did. And you find some of the elements that are like really, how can I say it? That are really easy to track. Some of the elements that are really easy to identify. And perhaps they can seem like a cliche. They can seem like an easy reference. Yeah, we're going to mention about one of the greatest inventions. Well, actually it was, as used for the people in the French Revolution in there. And you have some iconography, that's the word that I was looking for, in there it's embedded in there. And also you have a really interesting play in this case, because we establish some elements that are perhaps well known, and this is just I'm just going to show the first 2 pages of issue 5, where we can get used, at least in this part, to the violence. Once again, we are already located in a very difficult time, World War II. We are in a country that it's occupied. And then we have something that actually normalizes this kind of violence. If you like hunting, if you like this, perhaps you can say, well, if you have the head of one of the prey that you have already captured, it's normally something that you, as a civilized person, can exhibit in there. But that what happens then when we switch and it's no longer an animal, and it's something that it's actually that you can relate. Can you tell us a little bit? We have already mentioned a little bit about this, but about this kind of interaction when you take some of the same elements, but with the context, it can change completely.
Right. Yeah, so I was really interested in setting this ending in a taxidermy shop. This is not historically where Marcel was caught. No. His capture is it's odd. So his capture had way more to do with his impersonation of members of, he kept calling it fly talks, which you hear a little bit in this issue as well. So he was impersonating members of the French resistance. He says he wasn't impersonating them, that he actually was a member of the French resistance. But really one of the things I wanted to do with we're doing a comic. This is highly visual, and being able to give the reader visual cues is something that I think about with every page we write. Like, what do the visuals do along with what we're writing? And for this opening, I have, kind of playing over the top of Marcel's capture in this taxidermy shop, I have a portion of one of the chapters he wrote in a book that he actually wrote called Beating Chance, which is all about how to beat somebody at gambling. Like, how do you get luck on your side? And it's very much, I mean, you can hear it in that opening narration. It very much feels like this metaphor for, like, I've beat the system. I played and I won. But I wanted it over something that, again, I didn't want all of the gore of his human victims. I didn't really want to showcase a lot from that. That's not what I wanted this story to be. So setting it in the taxidermy shop felt like I could still signal to the reader who this person was, somebody that's in a store surrounded by death, while still not having to show just blood all over the walls or severed limbs all the time, which I'm sure Dean could draw gorgeously, but I didn't want to have to do that on every other page. So I still wanted to be able to signal to the reader, and I think it tells us something about him that he chose to kind of like hole up in a taxidermy shop and surround himself with death. The visual representation of death literally on the walls. And at the end of issue 4, we have a page that is entirely death. Like, it's just a page Dean drew all panels that are on shelves or hanging on the walls. And before we cut to Marcel, who's kind of luring in luring in his final victim.
And perhaps one final question about this before we go to the shameless plug section. And can you tell us a little bit about the balance that perhaps you were having some troubles, or perhaps it was really easy for you when combining facts with fiction? Because, well, it's obviously based on a real case. However, when we want to tell stories to make it more interesting for the people, or at least more interesting for you when you are writing the story, you have to add, and you have already mentioned some of these elements, some extra sauce, some extra condiments in here. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the choices made between what was kept and what was added in this case to make a more colorful picture?
Oh, absolutely. That was definitely one of the hardest parts. Knowing this case as well as I think I know this case, it was really hard to then step back and say not all of this can fit into the 5 issues while still telling a story. I'd say one of the biggest threads that is not represented is really his work impersonating a member of the French Resistance. He also had a couple of charges that don't quite come up in here. Things like he was selling or giving narcotics to patients without scripts or things like that. So when a case actually came against Marcel, the person that was supposed to testify against him went missing. So this is like this very, it's pretty obvious what happened to this person, though nothing was proven. So that's a side element that went. He had a run-in with a gang at some point. So there are things like that just, they're super fascinating, and I think they do help build the profile of the person that we're looking at in this story. But also I had to kind of remember the main thread that's going to carry throughout them. And one of the things I really wanted to bring this back to was somebody preying on, and most of his victims were Jews trying to flee the city. So I wanted to continuously bring this back to somebody that took advantage of people that were desperate, people that were trying to get out. Most of his victims died because they were trying to flee the city, and he kind of took on this persona of somebody that could help them flee to South America. And the vast majority of his victims went that way. So on the last page of the book, we do try to represent all of the names that are at least known. Not every name of a victim is known, but I wanted to show them because even though not all of them appear in this story, I want to, again, my purpose is let's try to individualize the moment and how we study history. So I wanted them all to be represented there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's oh well, I sorry I am spoiling this to who is watching this because that's the very end final page.
Yeah.
No, but it's something that it's also and we have already mentioned. It's something that you have to take into account because in case that once again the difference between a tragedy and a statistic is that if you were touched in this case or something from your family or at least the last name if you recognize something like that and it wasn't mentioned as in this case as one of the big victims, you can feel that you were minimized. And well, of course, it's not the intention. After all, also this is a work of fiction, so it's part of the things that you have to deal with that. And also it also ends with some of the notes that you were mentioning. Well, the actual death toll is estimated between 60 and 200 victims, and it's kind of complicated. Well, even now, and you mentioned it before with the COVID situation that we have right now, the estimates between the people who have been infected, it varies from country to country. I don't want to tell you about what's happening here in Mexico because we don't have tests, so we don't have people infected. So that's a crappy situation, but that's for a different show. But in this case, it's really really difficult also because the way that the actual case was surrounded by that. So I just imagine if you are an official from the French police in there, it's pretty much the same to register one person as a victim of a Nazi killer than as a victim, in this case, a serial killer. Right. That is that. But however, you also have to pay attention to the individual cases in here.
Well, that was a huge problem for them. And one of the things they noted was so many people came forward saying they had missing relatives that had tried to flee France. And they're like, well, was this person captured by Nazis? Were they killed by Nazis? Were they killed by the serial killer killing Jews trying to flee the city? Like, they don't entirely know. So there are a lot of people that were reported missing during this time period because even the Gestapo within the city, people were just disappearing. And that's a really troubling fact on its own. But then to note that somebody else was taking advantage of this. I mean, it's really difficult to try to, showcase that. But again, with the visual medium, we didn't want to showcase all of the horrific things that could have happened to them. We wanted to keep the focus on what is their story like? What is Massu's story like? What is his relationship with the son? And those kinds of questions that we were trying to parse out about occupied France. And also, why did the case kind of catch so much notoriety and attention for the people of France at the time? And it became very sensationalized. I try to show the media quite a bit. I mean, Dean does just an incredible job of showing on at one point just a bunch of flash bulbs going off. And it's like, yep, that's he was treated a little like a celebrity, and that's pretty troubling. And some of that final dialogue in the court scene is actual dialogue from court transcripts. Not all of it was said by Massu. Again, in a comic book with 5 issues, it's very hard to introduce many members of a legal team. So it's hard to show like 10 different attorneys or something like that. So again, we really needed to streamline a lot of things that were happening. But the line about the smoke from the townhome mixing with the smoke from Auschwitz is an actual thing that was said during this trial. And that line really got me when I was reading about this story. And I think it's one of the things that pushed me to tell it, was just about like, what is a city going through? Making the city its own character within the series itself was also a pretty important detail for all of us, I think.
Yeah, and perhaps I keep saying perhaps a final question, and then something else comes to my mind. And I remember, for example, Alan Moore. He booked an entire book about his hometown, and he also talks a lot about psychogeography, and it's one of the most precise, one of the most incredible examples of that is the way that he told about a different serial killer. In this case, his thesis about Jack the Ripper. So, can you tell us a little bit about the identity that you thought that in this particular case had Paris as the main place, because it also becomes a character.
Right. I think Paris was so fascinating to me because in chapter 1, I believe the title is The City of Lights, because this is what Paris is known for. And page 1, panel 1, you see the iconic Eiffel Tower. This city is gorgeous. It draws in tourists. It's vibrant. It's full of life. You think about Paris in the 20s with all of like the hub of just culture and art. And that's what Paris is really known for. So to see it go literally dark as Nazis occupy it, I mean, this is a really dark period of history. And we're looking at France in a really interesting time period. And one of the things that I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but I thought it was really interesting that we got to play a little bit with some cabaret elements as well. There actually were, at the time, people were writing like cabarets about the serial killer. That's how big this became in the city. So there were dances and performances about Marcel and being a serial killer. And I worked with Dean very explicitly on this scene, like, let's play this up. Like, the Nazis are watching this moment kind of play out of a cabaret where one woman is killing the other for performance art. This is kind of what the case devolved into, and this is not entirely like, our words and dialogue are made up over it, but there actually were performances written about this at the time. There were plays, there were dances. These pages Dean and Jason together on are just phenomenal.
All right, so there you have another reason so you can actually get this series. And thankfully, at least in the United States and in different parts of the world, now you can go to your comic store, the one that it's closest to you, and get this on print. I actually recommend it. Perhaps people can say, well, a regular comic can be $1.99, $2.99. Yes, but you are getting a prestige format and you are getting good storytelling, great storytelling, awesome storytelling in there. So if not, don't worry, you can get it in Comixology. You can get the digital editions, obviously from Dark Horse in there. But besides that, perhaps you can mention it about some of the other work that you are currently writing, because you have been very active in heavy metal and also in Aftershock, right?
Yeah, I do a lot with Aftershock. I like working with them a lot. So I think issue 2 of Artemis and the Assassin just came out last week. It's got a little bit more of a time traveling element, so we get to go all over history and time in that one.
But also with an element of truth, right? Because one of the characters is actually based in...
Yes, one of the characters. So this was like, because I found it so interesting writing Butcher of Paris and having to fictionalize elements for the sake of storytelling, I was like, well, what happens when fact meets fiction? And that's kind of how Artemis is born. A real life World War II spy is teamed up with a completely fictitious, almost superhuman of a character, and they travel through time together while trying to kill each other. So it's been a lot of fun to write with Francesca Fantini and Megan Hedrick on art, with Lauren Affey on colors, and again, Troy Petrie on letters. So that one's been a lot of fun. Tomorrow, I have a new book from Image and Top Cow coming out about pirates. Another one that is very much on the cusp of like historical fiction. So it's based in true events of the life of female pirates, but it is, there's so little known about them at all that it becomes very much a play on the myth involved with the two women. So also fun to write. And then in the fall, my work on Tarna will be coming out. So the first issue will come out in the fall. And that has been a lot of fun to write. Just, Tarna, giant swords and very cosmic creature. So yeah, it's been quite a departure from my historical fiction, but it's really cool.
Well, for example, it's kind of interesting because in English you have a particular word for history, which is like the actual facts, and story, which is something that you tell. In Spanish we use pretty much the same word, but sometimes we make the distinction because if you have history with a capital H, you are referring to the actual history. But don't worry, a history, una historia es una historia, history is history. So if people want to perhaps be a little bit more to know a little bit more about the titles, there are, I believe, a couple of places where they can find information about the upcoming titles. There's this one that I am really looking forward because it looks like something optimistic, that it's something that we really need right now. Yes. It will be a short story with Red Tornado, right, for DC?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
It was fun to write.
And there you can find about the different titles that you have been writing and some of the upcoming. Red Atlantis, I mentioned that this just right before we entered the interview, but it's something that I'm really looking forward in there. And if people want to get in contact, well, there you have also the different address and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. They can get in touch with you. Perhaps something else that you want to say to finish this little conversation?
No, just thank you so much for having me on. It's nice to kind of do a deep dive into a book like Butcher, where there's so much happening behind it, and like you said, it's 5 issues. So to kind of talk a little bit more about where that book came from, it's nice to have that opportunity. So thank you so much for having me on.
Au contrary, it was a real pleasure, and hopefully we will have you as a guest for a different show in the not so far future. Remember, this is mi casa es su casa, as they say in it's pretty much one of the few words in Spanish that most Americans know. The other one is puedo tener otra cerveza, can I have a beer, but that's a different thing. Remember that if you in the audience enjoy this kind of show, yes, we have a Patreon. I know everybody has a Patreon. Everybody and their aunt have a Patreon in there. But we actually have been working really hard for a lot of years, working with periodicals, working with audio, which is actually how this started, and working with video. So if you go to patreon.com/churros y palomitas, you will find a lot of content in there. For example, last week we have an interview with Christopher Canwell about Doctor Doom and everything, some of the titles that he has working recently. Netflix and Chill, where we give a recommendation about what you can watch in streaming. Open Mic, where the audience is actually part of this show, and we have a lot of shows about cinema, the future of industry, and storytelling in general. You can find all of that in patreon.com/churros y palomitas. And if you cannot afford to spare a couple of bucks, don't worry. Most of the content is already, look in there in our official page in Churros y Palomitas, which is almost live, like we are doing in here. And you can find most of the content in here available to everybody. So don't worry, not everybody just behind a paywall. But we certainly appreciate the kind of support that you can give us in here. Share this episode, and of course I really appreciate the time and all the knowledge that you have been sharing with us, Stephanie.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
All right, and let's finish this with the end credits, where you all can see all the people who make this show possible. No, that's the wrong screen.